Hi, everybody, and welcome to the first ever District 3 ASDA podcast. My name is Ari Edasami. I'm a Rising D3, and I'll be your host. Tonight, we'll be talking with some of our tooth buddies from District 3 about some advocacy hot topics in dentistry. These include licensure reform, insurance reform, and mid-level providers. These issues don't just affect us as dental students, but as future dentists. In addition, the current pandemic is affecting the progression and the development of these issues and the legislation that can change them drastically. That's why it's so important to learn about them and stay in the loop so we're ready to fight for them on our state and national lobby days. As we engage in discussion and debate on these issues, it's important to keep in mind that we're all members of the Tooth Party, and we stand in solidarity with ADA and ASDA's official stances. Before we get started, we have our District 3 trustee, Casey, here, who would like to make a statement addressing recent tragic events affecting the Black community. Casey?
Yeah, thanks, Ari. So District 3 and National ASDA both released a statement last week recognizing and denouncing the acts of racial injustice and police brutality that have been occurring across the nation, including the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and many others that have been named and also many that haven't been named. So just going with that, it's really important now more than ever that we are educated on current events, empowered to make a difference, and engaging with our communities and our peers and also legislators to make positive changes in our country and also around the nation. So with that, I would just encourage everyone listening to keep informed about these issues, and also it's never too early to register to vote and stay engaged in that way as well, especially as dental students.
I totally agree. Thanks, Casey. It was a really well put together statement. And with that, let's get started with some legislative updates. I know some of us, including myself, were at Lobby Day last year with our fellow dental students across the country advocating for some of these important issues that I just mentioned that are affecting our fields. I personally had a great time learning about these issues, meeting with my state congressman, being able to advocate and give personal stories and insights as to why these issues are important for us as students and as future practitioners. Do you guys know anything about what's been happening since Lobby Day and throughout the past year?
Yeah, so one of the things we were lobbying for was the ELSA, which is the Ensuring Lasting Smiles Act, which would mean that health insurance companies would have to cover any cranial abnormalities such as cleft lip and palate, which would be really positive because right now some of those fixes are viewed as cosmetic fixes, whereas they're really functional fixes and they have everything to do with somebody's quality of life. So something really exciting is that that was reintroduced to both the Senate and the Congress, and now it will be discussed there. So that's really positive. That's something we lobbied for there.
That's so awesome. It's super exciting to see because one of the dentists that I was lobbying with, he actually had cleft palate, and hearing his personal story just made it have so much more pathos when we were arguing why this needs to be medically necessary. These treatments are absolutely crucial to their quality of life. Seeing that it's moving along it's uplifting.
Yeah, I totally
And
agree.
I know, Mike, you know some stuff about the McCarran-Ferguson. What's been going on with that?
Definitely. So this is Mike Kerner from Pennsylvania in District 3. We'll get into this a little bit later, but the McCarran-Ferguson Act is broadly pushed by the ADA, which is basically in the realm of insurance reform in order to repeal the antitrust exemption that was established back in 1945, saying that insurance companies didn't need to listen to the antitrust laws at the time. So this is still in place and really makes a non-competitive environment for insurance companies and allowing them to prey on the consumer, which is us, the clinicians, as well as the people they cover. So the ADA is continuing to try to repeal parts of that McCarran-Ferguson Act. Specifically, a new bill, the S-350 Competitive Health Insurance Reform Act, has recently been introduced and is currently in Congress being voted on. This extension will repeal those parts of the McCarran-Ferguson Act that has language exclusively limiting the antitrust exemption of health insurance companies. So this is one huge step forward in the correct direction for more competitive health insurance and dental insurance for our profession.
Do you mind explaining what antitrust law means? Because I know when I was first learning about it, I had no idea what that meant.
Sure, absolutely. So basically, back in the times of the Roosevelt's presidencies, there were large corporations that cornered multiple sectors of the U.S. market. You can think of railroads, you can think of coal, you can think of enterprise. There was basically one big corporation that owned everything. And because one corporation owned everything, it completely limited the competitiveness of the market space, meaning that they could rig the prices, they could really do anything they wanted to the consumer without any competition. So the US government got involved and they said, hey, you can't do this anymore. We're going to split your corporation up into 3 or 4 smaller corporations, which then introduces competition in the market. So in the, say, instance of railroads, they took one large railroad line and split it up into 4 smaller lines that could offer competitive pricing. Same thing basically goes for every major US industry. Most recently, telecom has been kind of slapped around with antitrust exemptions because they say that, oh, AT&T and T-Mobile are merging their networks, but they're not merging their companies. Does that make them a trust? Does that make them being able to price fix? We don't really know. So it's basically on a case-by-case basis to determine if they are able to enact predatory practices upon the consumer. And right now, insurance companies can basically wield as much power as they want since this exemption was passed way back in the day. So in a nutshell, that's what a trust is, and that's why it's bad.
Right. But that doesn't mean that any progress is being made in that direction. A lot of times things are profit driven. So where the government should be stepping in and putting those checks and balances, they haven't been doing until now. And I think it's becoming even more relevant now when people are needing healthcare even more than ever.
Absolutely.
I think we're kind of lucky in a way that we're living through this pandemic to see how bad really things can get so we can appreciate the things that we've taken for granted till now in terms of healthcare, and realizing that this is a universal need and not just something that only people that can afford to have healthcare are entitled to. And the sooner we realize that not only do these issues move forward through Congress, but a lot of other issues that pertain to medically necessary things such as
Pre-existing
conditions, people that don't get medical coverage. It's basically messed up.
Exactly. And I can't wait to talk about more of that in the section later. But there's a lot that needs to change with insurance and everything associated with it in this country.
And kind of going off of that, the Higher Education Act was another bill that was lobbied for last year at Lobby Day. So since then, we've been reaching out to Congress, trying to make them realize the impact of debt on the students after they graduate from dental school and the choices that they make as they seek employment. They had a statement to the House Small Business Committee on June 11th, and it included some really candid stories of current dentists' struggles to pay off their loans and how it's affected dental school and career experiences. And they've sent 2 additional letters since then in September, again in October, and they were favorably reporting another bill called Protecting Our Students by Terminating Grad Rates, Adding Onto Debt, aka the Post-Grad Act. So it just seems like they continue to remind Congress of these issues that they would like to eventually pass once we have the opportunity to actually lobby with them next year. So ending those legislative updates, Kat and Casey, would you guys like to talk about how COVID is affecting licensure reform?
Yeah, sure. Licensure is a state-by-state process, so it's up to the state to decide what is the path to licensure there. So I know that there's been some changes in Pennsylvania, which the Hedge could comment on. She does go to school there.
Sure. So in Pennsylvania, they're changing the requirements for licensure only for the graduates of 2020 as of right now. They are waiving the perio-scaling requirement, and they're allowing students to take a non-patient-based restorative exam, aka on a mannequin tooth.
Kat, did you have anything to say about Florida and what's going on in terms of licensure updates there?
Yeah, hi guys, my name is Catherine, and even though I do go to dental school in Pennsylvania, I am from Florida, and I do plan on practicing in the state of Florida. So talking in regards to what's going on to practicing dentists in Florida, at least right at the start of the pandemic, around March 9th, Governor DeSantis declared a state of emergency, and I know that my dad had just gotten a temporary crown, and I know he couldn't go back to get his permanent crown due to this issue of the state of emergency, claiming that dental offices could not do any elective procedures and had to refer any emergencies to the hospital. So as things started to simmer down, obviously now they are, Governor DeSantis declared for elective procedures to be a go as of May 4th. So that's a plus sign.
It's kind of interesting to see how STEM states are moving forward with opening. And for me, I don't think it really seemed like dental offices really closed, because the office that I'm currently working at stayed open and still saw emergencies, but there was never a period where he completely closed down. And I think it really comes down to how willing the dentist is to work through those situations and be able to plan accordingly. All right, so I wanted to ask Casey, what do you know about the current licensure exam, and what are some of the problems with the existing live patient exam?
Yeah, so in our district in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and DC, the most common exam for licensure that students take is the 8X exam, which is administered by the CDCA. So that exam includes a mannequin-based endodontic and prosthodontic portion, and then also a patient-based periodontal scaling and also restorative examination. So with that scenario, it's a high-stakes, one-shot exam the point of the exam is to prove that you have the skills of a competent dentist so you can go out and practice with live patients. But it's been noted that competency is really a process. It's not a one-time occurrence. So that's one of the things about the current exam. And then also, you're relying on a patient. Students are forced to find their own patients for the exam, which can also cause stress for the patient missing work and having to take that day off, as well as for the student who's put in a position where maybe they pay their patient because they're missing time off work, or they have to find a family member. And that kind of puts the student in a moral position too. Like, is this a lesion I want to fill? Do I want to do these scalings that one specific day? Like, maybe I should do them a couple months earlier, but the exam's in February, so I'll wait until then. And if you can't complete the procedure that day because you have a substandard lesion or something along those lines, such as it doesn't pass the inspection in the beginning, then you aren't even able to do the exam that day and you automatically fail just because the patient didn't meet the standards that the examination board had put in place.
Some would even venture to say that it's unethical, that we have to work on patients that might not necessarily need that treatment, or if something happens to go wrong with the exam, there's no insurance for that patient who might require additional care to fix whatever was done wrong. So I think that at least trying to reform the current exam, maybe replacing everything with the mannequin could be great, but there's probably lots of other options. But as long as we just continue doing what we're doing, we're only hurting the community. And I think that in line with the stuff that we're taught in dental school to not harm your patients, I don't understand how this is demonstrating our ability to treat people ethically, but at the same time, we're not really demonstrating that through this exam.
Yeah, not to mention that everyone's taking a different exam, right? Because your caries are different than my caries. Your filling's going to look different than my filling. So it's pretty difficult in that way, too. At least having some changes would make it more standard across the board for every exam taker.
Right, I agree. And Kat, could you talk about what the three components of the new exam are as advocated by ASDA?
Yeah, so right now, ASDA is advocating for the new exam to have three of the following portions. So the number one would be a mannequin-based kinesthetic portion. Number two would be a non-patient-based OSCE, which stands for Objective Structured Clinical Examination. And this is the portion of the exam which would test students on their ability to diagnose, treatment plan, and their clinical judgment skills. So these clinical cases would be prompted through radiographs, charts, patient's medical history, etc. This section was pushed by the ASDA's Council on Dental Education and Licensure, which aligns with the ADA statement to eliminate live patients from the dental licensure examination. And then lastly, number three would be a submission of a portfolio of comprehensive patient care from the dental student, which I think are all three valid ways of showing the board or showing anyone like, hey, I'm ready to be a practicing and licensed dentist without causing any unethical harm or inhumane harm to a patient, which is what we've been learning for the past 4 years by then.
I totally agree. And I think that having that kind of portfolio, it is able to showcase the experiences that you've had working with people that have gotten to know you. And usually that's when your best qualities shine through, is when you're working with people that have seen you grow as a clinician. So having your faculty be able to speak favorably on you is so much more valuable than having somebody come in, do a procedure, not even ask how the patient's experience was, and judging it solely on a radiograph and looking at their mouth clinically. And as we've learned in our 4 years, or are going to learn, it's so much more than just the mouth that you're treating. You're treating a whole person. So I think that this would be such a more holistic way of testing and assessing people's ability to treat. On the flip side, what do you think are some things that could be lost in getting rid of this live patient component? Do you think there could be some backlash received from the existing dental community? Some people having graduated with the live patient versus people that are doing the new mannequin OSCE. Do you think that it would cause some states to be less open to portability of your license, being able to go to other states and practice outside of the state that you were licensed in?
I think there would definitely be some backlash from the older and conservative dentists in the community already, since they're the ones that took that exam that we want to change. But as we grow older, as technology advances, we learn that we have to adapt. And this pandemic, I think, is a catalyst for that change. We can't make patients come in when there's a pandemic. So I think this was, I don't want to say a blessing in disguise, but I think it's a nice way to go for some change in the right direction. And there's already so much stress and burden on the student on exam day, let alone like your entire license depends on your patient even showing up that day. I just think ASDA is advocating for a more realistic and a holistic way of evaluating your clinical skills.
Yeah, I totally agree. That was really well said, Kat. Another thing that could potentially be lost is that being able to treat patients for 2 years, we're suddenly going back to preclinical competencies, which may not as accurately assess our skills. But if we have those three components to the new exam and having a portfolio that supplements that mannequin-based component, I think that that would kind of solve that issue anyway. So what do you guys think are some things that we could look forward to with the new exam?
Yeah, so one of the things that you can look forward to is having dentiform teeth with stimulated caries. And those teeth are printed over and over again using a mold. So it's going to be the same for every single person, or as close to the same, especially closer than having different patients with different disease processes. So they've also developed those teeth to mimic cutting into real enamel and dentin. So you can really feel where that simulated carious tooth structure would be. So that's one thing that I'm thinking.
Pat, you had something to talk about the standardized patients.
So I know that the medical schools have integrated this in their licensure exams. Basically, we would have an actor who's called the standardized patient. And I know at Pitt, we do standardized patient and we collaborate with the theater department here. And I'm only entering my second year. And I've already done scenes where we talk to patients about cessation for smoking and talking about the caries process. And I know I'm looking forward, we have more SP sessions. So I think that would be a nice way of integrating that live patient / clinical skill portion instead of doing irreversible procedures on a patient.
Right. No, I totally agree. And having those actors, I feel like you're able to get a lot more creative and come up with scenarios that you wouldn't necessarily be able to find out in the community. I think that at least having had a system where they could set people up with patients, but to have to find your own patients and to be able to find like very specific clinical scenarios, it's just very limiting for students, and it can be expensive if it doesn't work out. One more question and then we'll move on to insurance reform. But why do you guys think it has taken as long as it has for these changes to come about? And how long do you think it's going to be until this live patient component is effectively removed?
Well, something we mentioned earlier is that licensure is a state-by-state process, so it really depends on the states supporting this new way of licensing dentists and approving it for new dentists to get licensed this way. So that's one reason why it's taken so long, is because there's no magic fix where everyone in the whole country will be able to take this new exam. So that's one reason why it's so important for students to share their stories at the state level and advocate for these changes, because it really affects dental students the most. So if dental students and dental school deans are advocating for it, that's how the most change is going to occur.
We're going to move on to our next topic of insurance reform. So Mike, what would you say is kind of going on in the world of insurance reform right now?
Cool, thanks, Ari. So the world of insurance reform, both medical and dental, is a big, hairy ball of wax, for lack of a better word. The ADA and ASDA right now are really advocating hard for that McCarran-Ferguson Act that I mentioned before, and its new extension, that S350, the Competitive Health Insurance Reform Act, that will repeal specific parts of that McCarran-Ferguson Reform Act of 1945. Specifically, the federal law does not prohibit state-regulated health insurers from engaging in collusive practices such as price fixing, bid rigging, and market allocation schemes. These anti-competitive behaviors hurts consumers by making health insurance less affordable. And that goes both ways for the consumer as well as the practitioners. So altogether, the state of health insurance in America really needs a drastic overhaul. And this didn't really happen overnight. As this was said, this originated back in 1945, right after World War II. And until about the 1980s, America was on par with the rest of the developed democratic world, mostly citing Europe as comparisons in this case. So the United States spent around 6 to 8% of their GDP on health insurance and health-related costs, we should say. That was all the way up until the 80s and 90s, where we were maybe within 1% of the rest of the developed world. That's including 31 countries that were seen as democratic and fully functioning countries on the global stage. So into the mid 80s and then into 90s, something really interesting pivoted in American healthcare. It was almost a perfect storm of three major industries that were all competing for money from the consumer. You have your health insurance companies on one hand, you have your hospital systems, which are now getting bigger, larger conglomerate group practices, and you have your pharmaceutical companies, which are beginning to pump out those big name drugs that we recognize every day, your beta blockers, your ACE inhibitors, things that make billions of dollars every year on the market. So this kind of triangle of patient costs was being driven exponentially higher through the 90s and into the 2000s, to the point where America's GDP was spending close to 24% on health insurance costs. Now, the rest of the world was still lagging around 10%, mainly because more socialized medicine was available in these countries. So you look at Spain, you look at Canada, you look at the Netherlands, countries like that, they were barely spending 8 to 10% of their GDP on health insurance cost, whereas this now bloating system in the United States was up there in the 20s. I think currently, as of 2017, we're up to 18%, and it's only projected to go higher, up to 20% by 2025. So why is this a thing? Does the U.S. do we use the health system more? Do we take more drugs? Like, why are we paying so much more than the rest of the world? Do we have better health outcomes? That's the one thing that everyone wants to look at. So if you look at, say, life expectancy in the United States, as of 2017, say a baby born in the U.S. is expected to live 78 years. It's not too bad, but the rest of the developed world is well over 80 years. Japan's up to 84, but they have one of the most robust, I'd say, insurance and social welfare systems in the entire world. So if you look at something like maternal death rate, that's supposed to be one of the major factors that people look at when they say, is this a developed country? Can they support their pregnant mothers giving birth? As of 2013, a mother was more likely to die in childbirth in the United States than they were in Havana, Cuba. And as of 2013, they were still in a trade embargo with the US in a fully undeveloped third world country. So it's hard to see where's this money going? If you look at one more stat, again with maternal death rates, you say for 100,000 live births, 26.4 mothers die in the United States, compared to 6.4 in Japan or 7.3 in Canada. That's almost 5 times the rate of deaths. In the United States, where we pay twice as much for health insurance and pay into that health insurance system than any other country in the world.
Yet we don't have universal health care. So that's like this big conundrum.
Exactly.
This money is going somewhere, but it just seems like it's mostly going into administrative costs and rejecting claims. I feel like if you leave them to do what they do, they're not going to want to pay for the services that we're trying to get them to pay for.
Absolutely.
And so administrative costs and the lack of accessibility to their services, it actually ends up being more expensive for us to even use insurance companies.
It does.
Which brings us to the question of, is this something that we should even participate in? And I think that that's what a lot of dentists consider doing, because they're just kind of fed up with this system. But in the interest of wanting to help people, I would never want to just be out of pocket only, because there's a lot of people that still buy into the system, and we need to somehow reform this and make it more of a good investment for people, because you're investing in your health. But if you're getting only a fraction of what you're paying for, then what are you really investing in at the end of the day?
Absolutely. And one of the most interesting things to look at, as you mentioned, middle management taking a lot of the cost burden of these health systems. So back in the day, health providers had solo, maybe 2 or 3 partners in a practice. And that was the most efficient method of providing care to a consumer. When we talk about the economy of scale, I'm sure you guys have heard it applied to toothpicks to iPhones. If you have a toothpick manufacturer in China, that could be one guy in a room cutting up bamboo and making toothpicks. Inherently, it's going to incur more costs than if you have a factory pushing out 10 billion toothpicks every day. But that's not able to be applied to healthcare. The unit of, sale of healthcare is one practitioner, one patient, and potentially one nurse or aide or someone else assisting with a procedure. The only thing that changes as you get larger, say with health systems, is the amount of middle management necessary to provide care. So in a physician's office or a dental office with, say, 2 practitioners, you have 2 front desk workers, maybe one person specializes in insurance, you have 1 or 2 dental assistants, and a couple of hygienists. That is the most ideal model of healthcare, because you have the smallest ratio of administrators to doctors to patients. As soon as you get into something like a large health system, where you have 200 doctors, who all need another layer of 20 managers, who then need a third layer of executives, who then cost somewhere between $1.6 and $3.1 million per year for one executive, who now manages, say, a team of 10 doctors or 15 doctors within their emergency department or family medicine. The economy of scale no longer exists. You're just basically feeding into a bloated health system that can no longer support its patients. And you say, okay, what about these systems that get so big they're too big to fail? This has been a really interesting shift in the last, I say, 1 to 2 years even, that the largest health systems now have cornered the markets in large cities. Up in Boston, you have I forget what they're called, but the one with Mass Gen and Brigham's Women's Hospital. That group of hospitals is so influential in the Boston area that they are able to dictate to the insurance companies what they want to be paid. If you look at their rates, they can charge twice as much, and the insurance will pay out for a procedure than a community hospital in the same exact neighborhood with absolutely no change in benefit to the patient. So they've gotten big enough, they've flipped the power balance. So before, all the insurance said, you're allowed to give these 10 procedures to your patients, right? Because insurance, if they don't pay, doctors don't get paid, patients don't get care. That's how it worked for fundamentally the first 30 years or 45 years of insurance with this McCarran-Ferguson Act. So this is fundamentally changing now that we have hospital systems large enough to demand better care for their patients. But unfortunately, they're not demanding better care. They're demanding a more solid bottom line. So health costs are actually going up for the consumer. They're going up for the insurers, and they're, in essence, lining the pockets of the administrators. So it's not a single faceted approach. But the interesting thing about dentistry now is it's a new concept within the world of insurance, right? So health insurance has been around much longer. It's had a lot more time to mature, and now we're seeing this power shift from large corporations now demanding something of their insurances rather than the other way around. We see corporate dentistry, right? All the big ones that have maybe 200, 400 practices. They're not large buildings. They're not big institutions like, let's say, Penn or Temple even, big hospitals that have massive overhead operating costs. However, they're getting large enough to now make demands of the insurance companies that previously weren't able to be done. You have a group practice with 5 dentists, and they all say, hey, we're going to stop taking Blue Cross Blue Shield. Blue Cross Blue Shield looks at you and says, okay, I'll go to my other 20,000 dentists on the East Coast, and their rates are going to go down. So we're at a pivotal moment within our careers and within our profession as a whole, where we can either band together and we can start demanding something of the insurance that controls our industry, or we can fragment and fight amongst ourselves and allow them to price fix and gouge and tell us what standard of care that we can give to our patients.
Wow, that was amazing, Mike. Thank you. And I think you kind of hinted on this, but how do you think that COVID is going to affect progression of McCarran-Ferguson and its reform?
I would love to see it have an effect, honestly. This global pandemic is opening people's eyes to the necessity of a social system that supports its people. I'm not talking about like a welfare state or a universal basic income. I'm just talking about that when you get sick, you shouldn't have to go into bankruptcy. And that's something that's not fundamental. So. Yeah.
What do you guys all think are some obstacles that are standing in the way of us getting this repealed? Because I think that everybody has a sense of a basic human right being that, if you live in a first world country, you should be entitled to basic health care, and that should include dental care. And I think that it shouldn't just fall to our policymakers to know what comprises a healthy person or not.
Absolutely. And you hinted at this earlier. Unfortunately, money makes the world go round. Everyone realizes that. And in just 2016 election cycle, these insurance companies paid for $56 million to pad the pockets of their constituents, saying, hey, maybe we don't want to repeal this act. Maybe you won't get your campaign donation next season if this goes through because we won't have the profits to share with you. So it's these massive pharmaceutical companies, health insurance companies, and healthcare companies, all three working together against the consumer because they have it made in the shape. They are trusts. They are a conglomerate of high-powered individuals who can pay to play the American political system. And without organizations like ASDA and the ADA, we would have no basis for a voice in this mess that is politics. But a single tree on a bluff gets blown over, but a whole stand of trees has a chance. And I think that's what we got to do. We got to stand like trees.
I just hope that somehow this crisis that we're going through is going to kind of almost force insurance companies to do what they're supposed to do and serve the people. And at the end of the day, I understand that they have a bottom line to meet, but it's a matter of how big is that bottom line and how much should their cut be? Because when you really crunch the numbers, I've heard presentations about how much the patient actually gets. It's like maybe a quarter of what they paid is what they get out in their benefits. And it's just disheartening for people that don't have the money to get the healthcare they need, but they pay for plans and they are under the assumption that they're going to get coverage, but that's fine print that every other person is not going to be able to read through and understand.
Absolutely.
Like somebody that's been working with insurance, and I've had that experience, but not everybody has that experience. And so I have Medicaid, and sometimes it feels like I'm jumping through hoops to just get the coverage I need. And if I didn't have that reception background, I probably wouldn't get any of the care that I was going out to get.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I recently enrolled Medicaid. You turn 26, you become a full-blown adult in society, and all of a sudden you need health insurance with no money to pay for it. So, I went through that whole kit and caboodle last year, and it took me, I think it was 6 months to get a primary care provider within my city. And I live in Philadelphia. I am literally a 10-minute walk from downtown with three of the largest hospital systems in the state right outside my back door. But because of the way the insurance is structured and the health systems are structured, it's exceedingly difficult to find primary care providers.
Confusing. Yeah.
It's so tough. And interestingly, it's The United States had the largest proportion of specialists compared to generalists or primary care providers of any other country in the developed world. It's because of basically the massive cost of tuition going to school. If you go into a specialty medical or dental field, you're paid exponentially more based on insurance payouts. So we're seeing that I think it was in the 80s, it was only 1.2% to 2% of all internal medicine residents went on to specialize after that. Just last year, actually 2018, so a couple years ago now, you saw 80% of internal medicine residents now specializing because they felt like they're forced to. We don't have nearly enough primary care providers to provide for our population because specialists have been basically taking over every niche, causing this whole vicious cycle to keep sustaining itself.
I think that people always go where the money is, and that kind of dictates everything. But it would just be nice to see a shift and have some more compassion for the people that they claim to be taking care of.
Absolutely.
What do you think are some things students could do to get involved on the more local level to get their peers informed on these issues and getting them to advocate for insurance reform?
I think the most important thing we can do as students is to be informed. Just keep up with things. I felt for so long up until this year, I really didn't know what was going on with insurance, and I was just kind of leaving that for when I'm out in the real world, leaving that for when I have to deal with it in the clinic, leaving that for later. But the more you're going into it, the better prepared you'll be on the other side. And I feel like that the attitude of letting someone else deal with it if your office manager does it is the worst thing you can do for yourself as a practitioner, because you don't know where the money's going. You don't know what the insurance companies are doing. And if you can't trace that, you're probably going to go out of business. So starting now, if we can be well informed on why policies are the way they are and what fundamental steps we can take to change them, that's the most we can do as students. And then transition that into our professional lives in the ADA. So from ASDA, organized dentistry, I feel like is a wonderful tool for political change because I don't have a bottom line of $10 billion as a pharmaceutical company to spend on lobbyists and campaign donations, all that fun stuff. But as an organization of 100,000 dentists worldwide, maybe we can actually make some difference.
Right. We know people that are in Congress that are practicing dentists, and we have that influence of word of mouth. Mm-hmm. And I think that if we continue to remind them and show how these laws can really bring about life-changing effects for people that really need that care, I think that they're more likely to move in that direction. And, you mentioned that people staying informed and knowing about this is so important. And I want to stress again that this is something that we're going to have to deal with when we graduate. And whether we like to or not, we're going to have to work with these insurance companies, whether or not they choose to play by the rules. And a lot of times they end up having that upper hand, but there definitely are ways to make the care better for the patient. And the bottom line is that we want to provide the best care possible for people. And there's always other options. We didn't get into this, but having dental savings plans offered to patients instead of insurance, if it's not something that is working for them, then, it might be better for someone to enroll in non-insurance option or, working with payment plans to help people through financial struggles. So I think that we as providers have a responsibility to serve our patients and not just rely on the insurance companies to do the right thing. We're supposed to do the right thing. So whether we decide to be an all fee-for-service practice or if we decide to enroll in everything in Medicaid and Medicare, we still have the responsibility to ensure that care is being translated to our patients. So on that note, I think it would be a great segue to mid-level providers, since they could potentially be a very pivotal part of the change in healthcare in this country. So Sahaj, do you want to talk about what exactly mid-level providers are?
Sure. So mid-level providers are basically people that are not dentists that are allowed to perform dental procedures. Examples are expanded functioning dental assistants, aka AFDAs, advanced dental hygienists, and advanced dental therapists. So dental therapists are really the focus of this discussion today because dental therapists are individuals that are not dentists, that have not received the formal 4-year training, but that are allowed to perform irreversible procedures. And ASDA's stance is that we do not support dental therapists being able to perform irreversible procedures. We believe that only dentists should be able to do diagnosis and treatment planning and to prescribe work authorizations and to perform irreversible procedures, and lastly, to prescribe drugs and other medications. So just a little history and background on mid-level providers, in this case, dental therapists. So dental therapists were first created in New Zealand, where they were originally called dental nurses, in order to address the lack of pediatric care, dental care that was there. So the goal was really to kind of start from the ground up. We wanted to address oral hygiene and oral health issues in children so that, things didn't progress. And, because if someone comes in later on in life with severe dental issues, then they have a harder time. It's harder on their health. It's more expensive. So we want to kind of nip it in the bud at a younger age. So the goal of dental therapists was to provide oral health literacy to children and their parents in rural areas where there wasn't access to care. And it was successful in New Zealand. So then Canada adopted it because, again, there are a lot of rural areas in Canada. And then Alaska also adopted it. And they wanted to use it in Alaska because there are a lot of tribes and there's, again, like a lot of rural areas. You can see a pattern. So dental therapists they really wanted to use them to kind of bridge the gap between underserved rural populations and cities. And so in Alaska, dental therapists were used as part of a community health team, which included nurses, primary care physicians, podiatrists, and of course these dental therapists. And they would kind of go from tribe to tribe to address all of these health concerns. And then it came to Minnesota, and then it was adopted in Arizona. And
do you think that the original intention of mid-level providers held true as it played this telephone from like starting out in New Zealand, and it had the intention of reaching out to those rural populations and educating, and now kind of where has it gone? Because when you mentioned Minnesota, that's kind of where I saw the timeline of mid-level providers start to go downhill, in my opinion, because they took something that was supposed to be implemented where it was needed and implementing it in places other than rural areas. Because as that statistic we've seen, out of 86 practicing dental therapists in Minnesota, only 9 of them practice in rural areas. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so the difference in these programs is that in New Zealand, dental therapists worked under the direct supervision of the dentist. But in the US, they don't have to work under the direct supervision. So in the US, they're given a 2-year training that is focused mainly on the practical aspect of dentistry. So they have great hand skills and they're really known for just like being very clinically good. But that doesn't mean that whereas we as dentists have 4 years of training in everything systemic.
We have the didactic component. So we actually understand.
So we have 2 years where we focus on the entire body and how, there are dental manifestations of certain diseases and how dental procedures can affect the whole body, whereas they're not given that kind of training. However, they are taught that if there is anything that they should refer to dentists if there's anything that is not included in the scope of their practice. But there's no guarantee that they will only practice in rural areas. There's no evidence that they solve this access to care issue because there's no requirement that they stay in rural and underserved areas. What's crazy is a third of our population, 102 million people in the US, live in a health professional shortage area, which is where there's no dentist for 50 miles. So if a third of our population lives in that kind of area, then we need someone who can address that, and it would take, there are 5,833 health professional shortage areas in the country, and it would take 10,635 dentists to meet that need, which is, we're not producing dentists at a rate that would satisfy that need, which is why dental therapists were created and, given these responsibilities because we wanted to expand access to care. But again, this does not guarantee that they do. And giving them the ability to perform irreversible procedures may actually cause harm because we know how every single procedure will affect the entire body and they don't get the same kind of training we do. And another thing to point out is that these dental therapists go to these rural areas maybe once a month. And so while someone who may have had pain could go and get that fixed, they don't receive comprehensive care. They go in for a quick fix because, again, they don't have the education necessary. They don't have oral health literacy. And as dentists, it's our job to provide that. We ultimately want to make our patients self-sufficient enough where they don't have to come back to us. We want them to understand good oral hygiene and how to take care of your teeth properly and what kind of systemic effects poor oral hygiene will have. But with dental therapists, they don't get that kind of comprehensive and holistic care and long-term care. And then, when the parents don't have that knowledge, then they don't pass it on to their children. And it's just like this cycle. So, there's so many health disparities, and we're trying to put these Band-Aids on it. And we're not really addressing the root of the problem, which is that there's such a lack of education.
It feels like we're almost like adding to the problem that already exists, because we're adding another component to the healthcare system, but it isn't really being made accessible like you said, in terms of literacy. We have that problem, especially in communities that don't have that access to education, are also facing a disparity in terms of their access to care because they don't know where to look for it. I think that the intention in New Zealand and when it was implemented in Canada, and I think that some people do truly still hold that view that mid-level providers could bridge that gap. If we were to, for instance, make mid-level providers be a thing, how could it be made so that they aren't abusing their powers and going beyond their scope and are actually addressing that need? Because people do need care, and that's why in some states they're willing to take that risk of potentially facing a health threat from someone that's not as qualified as a dentist, but it's better than getting no care at all. So could it be better managed and better regulated if it were made into a nationwide thing? If we were playing devil's advocate and saying like we were pro mid-level providers, what would you guys think could be some frontiers we face and have to be able to adapt to in order to make sure that it doesn't get abused?
Something really interesting you mentioned there was like the legality of it, making sure that mid-level providers don't overstep their bounds and start doing procedures they're not qualified to do. Looking from a strictly legal framework, I want to hear what you guys think about the concept that dentistry is only a profession because we are certified with a certificate from a school that says we are allowed to go perform dental procedures. And the reason we can do that is because a patient walks into our office and we say, hey, this is my diploma, I'm allowed to drill your teeth now. If two consenting adults sign a waiver saying that, hey, my tooth hurts and you're going to yank it out for me with a pair of pliers from your garage and I'm going to give you $100 for it. They sign a contract, they do that, and that happens just as it was. That is a completely legal construct in every single state in the union. Well, in the United States, I should say. So what is to keep a mid-level provider from setting up shop on the corner of, Broad and Walnut and saying, I'm a dental therapist, I don't have any qualifications, but I will yank your tooth out when it's in pain for $20. Where does it stop? You have your 4-year program now with your dentists, you have your 2-year program with your therapists, and let's say I can go to my next community college and go to school for 2 months and take 6 biology classes and say, I'm going to say I have an associate's in biology and a self-made dental practitioner of holistic dentistry degree that I got from the University of Phoenix Online. Nothing wrong with University of Phoenix Online, but where does it stop?
So a lot of dental therapist programs actually only require a high school diploma, which is surprising to me. It is a little bit scary because, again, it is our job to ensure that patients receive best healthcare possible. And, going into the ethics of it, we want to provide a maximal benefits ban. And I think to answer your question, even though that is legal, I don't think it's ethical, and I don't think that we should stand by that. That's why ASDA is advocating for regulations, and we do want to push for legislation that will limit what dental therapists can do. And there are solutions, and there are other types and roles that mid-level providers can play in a dental team. But
yeah, it's funny because our general stance is more against mid-level providers, but there actually are some alternatives to the dental therapist that are viable options and could serve the communities that have that disparity in care.
Yeah, so there's 2 types of mid-level providers that we really do think can play a super important role in the dental workplace. So the first is a community dental health coordinator. So again, to go back to why dental therapists were originally created, it was to address this barrier to care and this gap between rural areas and cities and this lack of oral health literacy. So community dental health care coordinators work on community-based prevention, care coordination, patient navigation, and the logistical aspect to it all. So they're trained to promote oral hygiene and provide preventative services like screenings, fluoride treatments, temporary fillings, and teeth cleanings until the patient can receive more comprehensive services from a dentist or a dental hygienist. So they kind of link patients to healthcare providers by coordinating logistics, and they will help provide comprehensive care, and they will, again, bridge that gap. Right. But not by performing the actual procedures themselves. They will help patients receive the care that they need.
And they're educating the patients and screening them to kind of point them in the right direction, because a lot of times it's not that there isn't care available and accessible to people, it's that they don't know where to look for that care. So we keep saying it, but bridging that gap, so to speak. And there's obviously multiple gaps that need to be filled, and in the interest of being ethical and doing it the right way, I think being able to navigate the healthcare system is like a huge challenge for some communities that aren't as well educated about what is available to them. And so being able to let people know that there is a solution and there is a way for them to have optimal oral health, because I think people just simply don't know. Yeah. And they'll come in when it's too late, and that's so heartbreaking to see, like a 7-year-old kid who already has bombed out teeth and needs root canals, and you would hope that you'd never have to see a kid that needs root canals at such a young age, but that is the case, and it really shouldn't be. So being able to bridge that gap and doing it early could really be something that these community dental health coordinators provide.
And to kind of add to that, one of the enticing things about dental therapists is that they are supposed to provide cheaper care. Like the goal was, again, to address the disparity. But then also, on the other hand, because these rural areas and like these underserved areas have the people that live in those areas, their top priority is not their dental care. Dental therapists receive a lot of the more complicated cases because there are no dentists in the area. Yeah. They're not trained in kind of treating those complicated cases.
I think you nailed the head on that. They're not only are they seeing someone with 1 or 2 decayed teeth, it's a whole mouth. And that's already complicated enough for a practicing dentist who's been like 3 or 4 years out already practicing in the real world. So I think where dental therapists are most vital and where they stand is for preventative care and just educating the patient and letting them know simple things like, do you drink fluoridated water, or like brushing twice a day, incentivizing them to do that. So that way they start realizing, if I start taking care of my mouth, my overall health will improve too.
And also FDAs, right, expanded functioning dental assistants, work under the direct supervision of a dentist. And so do community dental health coordinators. They work under remote supervision, but they are still under the supervision of dentists. And the community dental health coordinators don't actually perform procedures, which is like what you were talking about, Kat, providing that oral health literacy and educating people about how to take care of your health, overall. And another thing that community dental health care coordinators address is, they kind of point people in the direction of programs that could provide them with discounted rates and government help. And to go back to insurance, is that we want to expand Medicaid benefits, because one of the reasons people go to dental therapists is, again, because they provide what people think is more affordable care. And so by expanding Medicaid benefits, we can encourage dentists to treat more Medicaid patients.
Absolutely. Like you were mentioning before, how we have to have the framework of a system that will allow us to provide the care to the people that need it most. And so right now, that just simply doesn't exist, at least in our great state of Pennsylvania. As of 2011, Medicaid and Medicare benefits for adults was absolutely cut to the bones due to budget constraints, as it was justified in the budget of 2011, which has never been reinstated since then. They do not cover any procedure outside of, 2 cleanings a year, any immediate restorative work, and a simple extraction are the 3 things that you can get covered under Medicaid without any pre-authorization. Anything after that incurs an absolute mountain of paperwork. And if you need anything from a surgical extraction to braces, you have to have proper documentation, you have to have necessary approval, and a whole other mountain of paperwork in order to get that done. And with these programs, a lot of them are capitation insurance managed healthcare programs, which means that a dentist will see this patient for a flat rate per month, right? So say a family of four is going to net the dentist somewhere between $36 and $80 a month flat. So if they're getting that check every month for that one family, what's the incentive of that dentist to actually see them and give them care? If I'm getting my $80 a month and I don't see him for 6 months, and say, oh, well, that's $80 in materials that I'm saving every month. And it just gets worse and worse. If you're not calling your patients for recall visits, you can sign up, say, 100 families at one of these community drives, never see them again, never call, follow up with an appointment, and then you're just enhancing your bottom line without having to give out any kind of services. So for a lot of these insurance plans, it's both predatory and inhibitory of getting proper care.
Also, one other aspect of healthcare that's just being explored more that also has to do with insurance is teledentistry. How many telehealth visits are included in insurance. And, especially with the pandemic, even though some dental offices might be closed, we're kind of looking more into teledentistry. And that's one of the things that ASDA is pushing for, is to address this barrier to care is teledentistry. We are decreasing costs, we're increasing access to pediatric care, and even though we can't obviously perform procedures over our webcams, we can provide instructions for how to brush your teeth. We can provide that oral health education.
I always tout education in any field as the most important and biggest barrier to getting people to the care that they need. So when we're in this time when we can meet with our patients, having teledentistry to be able to give them instructions and to kind of take more responsibility for their own health, because they're not going to someone simply to just receive care anymore. They're actually seeking that care themselves and then being able to take that information with them and apply it in their life. I'm really glad that you mentioned teledentistry, because it could be something that, maybe even mid-level providers in the future could use as an adjunct.
And I just wanted to add another recommendation from ASDA and the ADA. So first we talked about community dental health coordinators, we talked about teledentistry, we talked about expanding Medicaid benefits, and then two more things. So the first one is encouraging FDAs, employment of FDAs in our offices. So FDAs are expanded functioning dental assistants, and they can perform reversible procedures. They also operate under the direct supervision of a dentist, so it's kind of like the dentist drills and the FDA fills. So the FDA can take x-rays and do sealants, and they enhance productivity without compromising the technical quality of care. And our goal as dentists is to treat as many patients as we can with quality care. And so the employment of FDAs and the use of FDAs in our offices increases the number of patients, increases productivity, decreases the stress and the workload on dentists themselves. And it also decreases the amount of hours that everybody in the office has to work without decreasing income. And then the fifth thing that I want to talk about is that students and dentists are encouraged to participate in National Health Service Corps and other scholarship programs, like incentives to go out once a week, maybe to a rural area, or spend a year working as a dentist or volunteering in those areas that may not be receiving as much care as they need to.
Before we wrap it up, I just wanted to say how it's so interesting how these issues all intertwine at some points, because the choices that we make after we graduate on whether we're going to go into those areas that don't have enough outreach versus going somewhere that we think is going to be most financially beneficial. And without having the licensure reform to make getting our licensure requirements done more accessible, without having our student debt better regulated so that we can afford to go to dental school and be able to build our careers the way we truly want to without money always being kind of at the forefront, that plays into whether these healthcare needs are met and whether these healthcare shortage areas are being addressed. And until certain issues are addressed, it's hard for us as dentists to take on that moral responsibility to go to those places where we know we need to be working instead of going places that are already adequately populated with dentists and are getting their healthcare needs met. So when we advocate for one issue, we really are advocating for all of these issues, because they all kind of go hand in hand to the experience that we have as dentists and then as the patients that we treat. Do you guys have any ideas for how we can continue to advocate and stand for the face of organized dentistry, throughout the coming months, throughout COVID, throughout Black Lives Matter, all the movements that we're living through and are kind of propelling our field towards this unforeseen future, and how we can kind of play our role to further organized dentistry and create a better future for ourselves?
It's all over the news and everything. The Black Lives Matter movement is It's going on, and it's important that we acknowledge it. So I just want to say this to all my fellow dental students out there who's listening to this, that, you have to do your own part. And as medical professionals, you have to stay educated, even if it means, watching a documentary on the Black Lives Matter movement. And I know it's hard, especially because we're all in school and we're also battling a pandemic, but enough is enough. Ignorance is a choice here, You can't, I'm sorry, Google is accessible. Don't tell me that. I know you use a laptop to study. So I think we should encourage students to do your own part and stay educated.
I think too that it's really on us to keep our peers accountable for their actions. I think in dental schools, we've all seen some microaggressions, even some straight up out front aggressions. And it's really important that we advocate for our Black colleagues and just make sure that people know that those aren't okay. They have a place in our community and they're welcome here. And we appreciate all they add to our community of dental professionals. So it's really important that if you see someone taking part in a microaggression or saying something that promotes this culture of racial injustice and systemic racism, that you make them known that it's not okay and you don't stand for that. And even if you don't feel comfortable providing them resources right then, it goes a long way just to show that if they're your friend or your colleague, that it's not okay and you don't welcome that.
Coming at it from an eye of insurance reform, what I've been talking about is that poor Black communities, especially in the Philadelphia area, have been exploited for years, basically by the lack of access to care. And that's all due to the lack of governmental support. I mean, basically since the days of segregation. The hard truth is that it is very difficult for these economically disadvantaged primary Black communities to get good quality dental care. It increases the health disparities gap in these populations and leads to overall oral and systemic health problems in the future. And unfortunately, many dentists already don't treat Medicaid patients because of that pay scale or sliding pay schemes we talked about, either capitation programs or just reimbursements not being where they need to be in order to create a system where the dentist can provide care for everyone they need to. And it's not because the dentists don't want to treat these patients at all. It's because the current state of health insurance does not allow them to and keep their business afloat. There's simply no way to see a patient and only get reimbursed, say, $30 for cleaning and scaling, or maybe $60 for restoration. It just is nearly impossible with the cost of materials and labor that the dentist has to provide. That is just another reason why it is so important to reform these institutions so that everyone can get access to the care they need.
I think we want to make all of these changes, and as dental students, sometimes we feel like we don't really have a voice, or we're just one student and thousands of students. But we do have a voice. We have the ability to make a change. Our votes count, our voices count, because every single school has an ASDA chapter that then goes and lobbies to Congress every year. We can make a difference, and it is our responsibility to provide the best healthcare possible for our patients. And that includes, making sure that legislation that is dictating how we practice ensures that. We're trying to make sure that the way we practice is not dictated by people who don't understand what it is to provide the best healthcare possible for patients. So we want to change the fact that, there are racial injustices. We want to change the health disparities. We want to make sure that the patients that we treat receive the best healthcare possible. And the biggest way that we can do that is by voting, and voting in this upcoming election, voting for local elections, and making sure that we use the systems that are put in place for our voices to be heard. So I think it's very important for us to just talk about how, as medical professionals, we cannot ignore what is going on.
I just wanted to say that I think the Black Lives Matter movement just shines even more light on issues that we already knew were present. And those health disparities that you touched on are really obvious, especially in some of the schools that we attend and where they're kind of strategically situated so that we can have access to these populations. It kind of shows that we have something that's largely unaddressed. And adding on to what Kat said, being educated on how disproportionate these healthcare needs are being met or not met can help lead the way that we treat people and treat compassionately, and realize that having a healthcare need isn't based on the color of your skin or where you come from. It's something universal, and every life matters, but the people that have been deprived of this need really need to be paid attention to at a time like this. But there's definitely something we need to to pour our focus into. And beyond responding to a global crisis, we need to respond to a social justice crisis that has been plaguing our society since the days of Jim Crow and slavery. It might not be blatantly there, but it's definitely still there and something we have to address as the dental community. Thank you all so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed listening as much as we enjoyed discussing these hot topics. Please check out the ASDA District 3 Instagram to leave us any questions or feedback you might have, and for a summary and recap of everything we hashed today, and to learn more about what you can do to advocate for your future in dentistry, check out the handout on our Instagram page. I hope you guys have a safe and sunny quarantine. I'll talk to you guys next time.